information public, but if you can then start uniquely identifying the people in that public data set, maybe for the people who died, that's not so important, but the ones who are still continuing to live, it might be an issue. All right, so the researchers came up with the concept of k-anonymity. So the idea was originally when you wanted to anonymize, you would just erase the name and maybe the date of birth. But it turned out that if you just use the year of birth, gender, and zip code, you could identify up to 87% of the people in an anonymous database. And so what they suggested doing is called k-anonymity. So you suppress certain information so that k people at all times cannot be distinguished from each other. So if you look here, the first two have the same birth years, and the first gender and the zip code has been suppressed so that they're the same. So that way you know one of the two people you might know, but you don't know, you only know with 50% chance which disease they have, even if you know all that information. Right, so this was the idea. You can imagine k needs to be bigger. The question is, how big should k be? So we again have the threshold problem. There's no answer to that. Those are the solutions. Now let's go to the critical perspective. Anonymization has failed. Okay, so when Sweeney did the first study where she identified 87% or so of the database, she proposed k-anonymity, and then people showed ways to attack k-anonymity. They came up with t-closeness, and then they came with L-diversity, and they came up with a bunch of new schemes in which you could scramble the data, and the database still get some utility out of the data without identifying individuals. It turns out, intuitively and mathematically, this does not work. You cannot anonymize databases and give any guarantees over time. This was intuitively shown and mathematically shown by Shmatikova and Narayanan, who said you can always find another database. It could even be an anonymized database. But you can always get more and more information. Eventually, linking a lot of databases, you will be able to identify 70, 80, 90% of the database. So this idea that you can anonymize and you will not be identified is a myth. What is interesting is data protection relies on us being able to do anonymization. Because data protection says if you anonymize a data set, you can do whatever you want with it. You don't have to comply with anything anymore. It's free. Anonymization says, the results say you cannot anonymize. That means personal data now is any data. That means data protection applies to every data. That means data protection is nullified, right? So this is a big problem. I'm not trying to say data protection is over and dead, but it's a big problem for the policymakers right now because A, they're trying to get their heads around the mathematical problem, and B, they're trying to figure out how they're going to save personal data. Okay. There's some recent proposals on how to deal with this. Cynthia Dwork is the one who then also mathematically showed why anonymization will never work. Instead, she came up with some other way of doing things, which is, you know, that idea with anonymization was that you build a big database, you anonymize it, you give it to the world, and everybody's happy. AOL, search queries, typical example. Differential privacy says you build a database, you try to anonymize it. I don't think you even have to anonymize it, but yeah, of course you have to anonymize it very simply, but you allow people to do queries on that, you limit the number of questions they can ask, and you make sure that once they hit a specific threshold, again the threshold, we don't know how far, once they hit a threshold, they cannot make queries anymore. And that allows them to protect against intersection attacks, etc. You don't need to know about this. Just the point is they're doing this interactive database. They don't release the database to the whole public. You can make queries to it, and they limit the queries so that certain breaches do not happen, mathematically defined breaches. Okay. So the problem with anonymization, regardless of if it works or not, it's still something people use, right? People will say, I have anonymized. I mean, if you go to privacy policies, we anonymize your data before we share it with the third parties, etc. It's very much about an economic logic. It's also used in universities, etc. I'm not trying to criticize it all the way, but if you anonymize data, you basically enter the economic logic. What is also important to notice, remember the surveillance definition I gave, surveillance is still intact when you anonymize. So you can still look at the whole population, you can start doing discrimination and social sorting. Notice, privacy and data protection says very little, if anything, about this kind of privacy problem, right? They don't see it as a privacy problem almost. It's something else. Because privacy and data protection are very much focused on the individual. Surveillance as a problem, if you want to see it as a problem, is focused on social sorting and communities and discrimination. So I talked about data protection being at unease. We need further research on this topic. It's a bit of a dead end, and we need to see where it goes. Okay, let's come back to the anonymizers. So some of the assumptions that the researchers make with respect to anonymizers are as follows. There is no trust on the internet. If you put your data, it's gone. And this one is very important. Users are individually responsible for minimizing the collection and dissemination of their data. If they know your data, they being whoever, then they know you. So there's this really direct connection between your data and yourself and your intentions, etc. Collection and processing of personal data, if used against you, will have a chilling effect. And technical solutions should be preferred instead of relying on legal solutions. These are like typical assumptions. Not everybody will make all of these assumptions, but these are the set of assumptions people mostly play around with that argue for the use of anonymizers. No, hold on. Okay, so I'm just going to show you a quick film, and then we'll go on with the critique, okay?
In the 90s, privacy research started becoming popular among security engineers. Privacy was defined as the right to be let alone and could be guaranteed in systems through data concealment. Specifically, security engineers were focusing on what they called anonymization. Some researchers in Dresden, Germany, were specifically looking to anonymize cell phone infrastructures. Anonymization meant that a third party could not infer by observing the cell phone infrastructure who were making phone calls, at what time, and from which location. In order to do this, researchers suggested adding encryption, dummy traffic, and mixes to the usual cell phone infrastructures. Although these additions guaranteed significant anonymity, the researchers ran into an unexpected physical problem. Two identical cell phones from the same manufacturer, coming out of the same assembly line one after the other, had enough differences in their electromagnetic fields to be distinguishable. The electromagnetic fields could be used as signatures and utilized to trace the users. The researchers had not considered this environmental factor in their anonymity model. They were devastated. The Dresdner researchers started collaborating with other researchers doing similar research in Scandinavia. They started discussing how they could achieve absolute anonymity. The Scandinavian researchers said, "Let's imagine an anonymous city. In this city, everybody should wear a box as soon as they leave their homes. These boxes should be as wide as the widest person on Earth and as tall as the tallest person on Earth. The boxes should be standardized so that they are indistinguishable. When the citizens walk, they should do so in the same manner and as slow as the slowest person on Earth. This way, they cannot be profiled according to the way they walk. If possible, they should leave their homes at selected intervals so that they cannot be profiled through the times in which they enter and leave their homes. Even better, dummy traffic should be introduced to the city. Meaning, 2 or more boxes should come out of each door, one containing the citizen, the other containing robots. When departing, the boxes should move in opposite directions so that it is difficult to distinguish boxes through their entrances and exits. Further, between 2 locations, different paths should be taken every time so that the citizens cannot be profiled according to the paths they use frequently. In this anonymous city, the citizens have asked to give up some of their anonymity in order to be able to move in the city with their pets. As a result, we have added some anonymity boxes for pets. As they discussed further, and the inconveniences of the anonymous city became evident, the researchers concluded that maybe this is not the way we want to live.
Okay, I mean, it's a bit of an extreme, right? Like, if you really want to have anonymity, but I think it's a nice way of also introducing, it's also a nice way of introducing how anonymity sets work, right? Like, and also how difficult the task is of building an anonymizer that actually gives certain guarantees. But let's go back to the assumptions. I want to focus on one of the assumptions, which is that users are individually responsible for minimizing the collection and dissemination of their data. This is also the case where, a lot of us will make this logical argument, users don't care, they're too stupid, they can't use them, right? This whole thing. But actually, maybe there's another perspective on this. So if you look at some of the surveillance studies authors, they would say, we live in a networked world, so the idea that you have to isolate yourself from the network in order to protect your privacy is actually counterintuitive to the fact that we have to constantly show we're connected and networked. The systems that we use do not want to identify us, they want to know where we are in the network. So isolation is not really an option. Some marketing people using Foucault's theories said, this idea that you can protect yourself, let's say, from marketing systems and advertisement, etc., by pulling yourself out individually from, the marketing databases is actually a false perception of privacy, because these databases are actually made by the marketers. They define the language, they define the categories, and in the worst case, when you pull yourself out, you're put into the category of people who care about their privacy, right? So you can't really come out of this logic. Sorry, guys. It happens, all right. So David Phillips, on the other hand, reminds us of the fact that privacy has been actually a very contested matter. If you look at feminist history, violence at home as being, private being the castle in which women are subject to violence. If you look at queer history, the heterosexual bedroom being sacred and being, going public to question this notion of privacy has been an important part of our political activities. And actually, you do see a lot of the privacy breach examples in newspapers is actually about reinserting very conservative values about how you should consume alcohol and drugs, how you should express your sexuality, what you should say about your political opinions. So it does become actually a reinstatement of a very conservative value of what privacy actually should be. So it's not always a good thing. John McGrath, who wrote this wonderful book called Loving Big Brother, says actually a lot of our daily activities, behaviors, or what he calls it, performances, are actually so intertwined with digital technologies and surveillance technologies that saying that we should do without them is kind of like saying, let's go back to nature. What is problematic with that we can discuss maybe offline. Okay. What's more important, and this comes back again and again to the surveillance perspective, is that surveillance is about social sorting. That means it's about not necessarily identifying you, but identifying the set of groups that are going to be discriminated in a positive or negative manner. So as long as you can be identified as fitting the categories of some sort or not fitting them, you're already part. So individually going out of that is not going to work. Further, there's this idea that you as an individual are the only one that reveals information about yourself. I'm not talking, there's of course this typical problem that, a lot of your friends will reveal information about yourself, but actually a lot of information does not reveal information about one person, it reveals information about many. Let me try to give that example here. So if I know by looking at a social graph, I know in this graph, Joe and Alice are in this graph, and I know that Joe has 3 friends and Alice has 4 friends, right? And if you see the green dot with the pentagon are the two anonymized nodes in this graph, which have 3 friends, and the 2 purple ones are the 2 profiles that have 4 friends, then I know for sure that Joe and Alice are friends. Neither Joe nor Alice has revealed this information to me. I can just infer it from the general structure. So information actually does not behave as we expect it to behave in some of our assumptions. The next problem is anonymous is vogelfrei. Vogelfrei is a German, I use a German word, I think there's an English equivalent as well, a concept from the medieval ages that you can sometimes lose all of your rights, especially the rights to property, which means you're also free to do anything you want, but in addition to that, anybody else is free to do whatever they want to you, right? So the wonderful thing about anonymity is that you're outside of the data protection scheme. So that means that you cannot reclaim any data that you have left behind anonymously. There were some problems with AOL search queries. People have made films out of those queries. The people would not legally necessarily be able to, say, this is my data, you can't do this, because once they get into the anonymous sphere, there's no legal protection. Maybe this is wanted, huh? I'm just putting it up there. Okay, anonymizers also don't deal well with persistent communications. So if you use an